My CTO averages about 60 PRs a day. That's what happens when you eliminate all the rework that AI generated code produces.
My guest today is Kim Modeste. Kim's the CEO and co-founder of Mault AI. Kim, welcome to the pod. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
You want to tell us a little bit more about your background and exactly what Mault does?
Yeah. It'll probably be a little surprising for some. I'm not a developer by background. I'm actually from the hospitality industry, of a background in economics and quantitative finance, and of really just I've worked for some of the largest restaurant brands in the world on data analytics side. So starting Malt, I came to this as an outsider, reading stories, talking to people in the industry, and feeling the frustration of AI in my own workflows. So was using Lovable, right, to build hobby projects like some people might be familiar with. And the experience was really always the same. And it was that it works locally and it looks great in a demo. And then you try to take it like near production and it just falls apart. And I noticed the same pattern everywhere. So really what we did is got together with my co-founders and we wanted to solve this problem. So what Malt does, it brings a deterministic layer to a probabilistic AI model. And it's very binary, yes, no, it works, it doesn't. And what we do is we basically eliminate all the rework that AI generated code produces.
You talked about kind of your own problem dealing with the types of code that you would actually get in production out of these things. When you were talking to other folks, what were some of the common pain points you were hearing again and again that made you say, hey, this is a broader problem that I want to spend my time on?
Yeah, I think we see two distinct groups, really. I think the first hasn't fully deployed yet. So they're watching competitors move fast with AI and they really don't want to get left behind, but they can't really figure out how to do it safely. So I would say they have an issue kind of with confidence. And so they don't have the framework for what safe deployment really looks like. And then the second group, I would say, is already using it, but they've kind of hit a different wall where that's kind of, as I mentioned first, the velocity promises are really real at first. Like it does allow you to move very fast, but the rework starts eating at it. And so like AI generated change just really breaks a lot downstream. And so like a merge would introduce like a pattern that violates a standard like nobody caught until review. And so like what's happening structurally is most tools were built to review code were really designed for human authoring, right? And so that velocity was a lot lower than it is now. And then AI just kind of blows that ratio apart. So generation is incredibly fast. The enforcement infrastructure didn't really keep up. So without it, you've just moved the constraint, not really eliminated it. And so the rework is really eating at that velocity and the ROI like never shows up. And so those are the two things that we're really hearing. And those are kind of the two groups that we're really approaching to kind of solve their problem.
Yeah, just because you're creating all this code doesn't mean it's all ready to be merged and implemented in production, I guess. What types of levels of rework are you seeing in the industry?
Yeah. So I guess the problem is a lot of it is not measured. I think there's still a lot of people that are deploying AI across their engineering orgs that are like still waiting for some of the ROI here. What I can tell you is that like the stats right now are that 93% of developers are using AI in some form or fashion in the workflows and output is increased at about 10%. So what they're not getting are those gains, and the rework just continues at those velocity gains. Rework, again, is like just because the tools haven't kept up with velocity. So what you're seeing is like traditional CI/CD pipelines, right? They're not catching it. Traditional code reviews aren't catching it. And then the ones that are able to, there's just a lot of human in the loop where you kind of got to go back and do a lot of rework. And so though it gives the illusion, right, that things are moving quite fast, is at the end of the day, like they're not moving any faster than they were before. And it's kind of borrowed confidence is what we're seeing.
So how did you arrive? Layering in a bit of determinism is really kind of the right architecture approach for this problem. And then two, whenever you introduce some layers of governance, let's say historically, usually there's a trade-off with velocity there to a certain extent, or that's at least the perception. How do you think about the trade-offs there when you're looking at Malt?
Yeah, I think when it comes to using determinism, the models are probabilistic. So they kind of optimize for the most plausible, right, code, the most plausible answer. So like even if you were to like ask Claude or ChatGPT to create a document, right, with the exact same spec 5 times, you're going to get 5 different documents. And that's just a nature of like probabilistic systems. So they optimize for the plausibility and then not really the fixed standards. code is different, right? It either works or it doesn't. And so like we're saying that there should be no plausible in production. Like AI is becoming the primary author of code. And we're basically handing that to a fundamentally probabilistic system. And that's not necessarily like a model problem, that's an architectural problem. So probabilistic systems, they need a deterministic layer, and that layer just doesn't exist. That's why we built Malt. So we're saying that we have to be able to mathematically prove like every line of code, and that's exactly what we're doing with the determinism. In terms of the trade-off between governance and speed, I'd push back on that framing, because for us that trade-off really isn't real, at least not in the way most people think about it. When you hear governance, I think, like most people do, you think friction, red tape, maybe chains of approvals, right? That's what governance has meant in software as well as other industries for decades. And I think that's pretty fair. But what we're talking about is different. I think Malt doesn't really add process on top of your workflow. It really just enforces standards inside of it. So it's like at the point of generation, before bad code can even exist. So the friction people associate with governance, the back and forth, the review cycles, the rework, that's what disappears with Malt. And so when that disappears, you actually move very fast. For example, my CTO averages about 60 PRs a day. And I think to some people that probably, right, seems unfathomable, but it's the truth. And that's what happens when you move the rework tax. I'd actually argue that Malt is like as fast as you can go right now when writing production grade code. So the trade-off, like for us, isn't governance versus speed. It's really rework and risk on one side and like governance velocity on the other, if that makes sense.
No, that does. And we're not in a space now where it's just like a individual software developer that's leveraging like a single interface to generate code. We're now in a
Yeah.
orchestrated workflow environment as well. And at each chain in that orchestrated system go a certain direction and cause quite a bit of variance from like the standards or the expectations. How do you think about what the implications are for coding as the complexity kind of continues to get exponentially higher? And then what types of organizations are really needing to embrace this kind of approach to coding? Is it really just the highly regulated spaces, or startups still saying like, we're willing to experiment and try a bunch of things, and if it breaks, we'll just fix it later?
Want to do things kind of a little bit more risky. Maybe they have a higher appetite for that. They want to move faster. And I think, again, you throw the word governance around, they're like, that's not for me. And I think we'll continue to see that. I think, though, the mature enterprises or those that have kind of been burned by AI, right? I think we're like one large accident away from like heavy regulation with AI. I think that like they're more open to kind of hearing about like the problem that we solve. And industry agnostic, really, when it comes to governing AI generating code. But I think like the minimum viable governance, right, before AI touches production systems are probably three things that are absolutely non-negotiable. And one would be like an immutable audit trail. Like that has to happen, I think, for every generation event. Like every flag, every approval, right? Like needs to be time-stamped, tamper-proof, like queryable. I think those are like, you have to have those. I think you need to be able to answer what happened, when did it happen, who approved these things for any change that touched production. So not from memory, like from a structured record. I think the second would probably be like role-based enforcement. So not all code is equal, right? It's like, so something that like touches a payment processing system needs like different enforcement than a UI component. I think we all know that. And the layer has to like be able to differentiate automatically based on context, but not based on somebody like remembering to actually flag those things. And I think third, and what really differentiates Malt, among other things, but is local execution. So like having the code not leave the environment, right? Every analysis, every check, every rule of evaluation runs locally. So it's like zero exfiltration risk, essentially. And I think that's a floor. I think everything else is a configuration on top of that foundation. And that's exactly like the architecture that we built for, which is like regulated consumers are going to need those things. They're non-negotiables. But I think, again, like the more people experiment with AI, the more they realize that the ROI is a little bit more elusive than they thought. There's a lot of reasons that people would want some type of governance.
What types of guardrails or what types of work do organizations need to do on the front end in order to enable something like Malt to be able to understand their standards and use that as a practice of checking and verifying some of the code that comes out? Or does it work pretty much out of the box?
Yeah, it works pretty much out of the box. Obviously, we can have custom configurations depending on what the industry standards are, or if somebody comes to us and say, "Hey, we like our workflow to look like this." But it comes out of the box, so Malt's pretty easy to use. It's work to kind of be that infrastructure that's built into your workflow that kind of feels invisible. So yeah, and there's not a lot that needs to be done or that teams need to prepare for Malt. I will say though that it is a cool change. When we see folks using Malt and going a lot faster, there's really a shift in terms of like what do engineers do with the time that they get back. And that's where we kind of help facilitate that is like, hey, let's accelerate your roadmap. Let's work on features that you've kind of put on the back burner. So that's kind of tough, I think, for some teams to get used to. But I think that'll be there regardless if Malt's involved or not. We're kind of in this new age where AI is allowing people to free up their time. We're allowing it to just be 20 times more than what you would normally get.
Yeah, I guess to that point, right? Even Dario at Anthropic is saying that 95% of their code is generated now by AI agents. And so, but they're still hiring engineers,
Right.
right? So they have a role. How have you seen the role change for engineers over time?
With Malt, especially Malt that is actually allows us to catch problems at generation, so not review. So the cycle becomes a lot faster because there's less to fix. And I think like the second pushback is like workflow, which Malta is not really another SaaS tool that you're adding to your stack. We're infrastructure. We sit as far left as possible in the workflow, even though we do touch the entire development life cycle. So it's like you get to incorporate it into your workflow without feeling like you've adopted another system. So the goal is to be invisible. So wherever your engineers work, the enforcement is there. But I think the third one, and which I just touched on, is I think the main thing is like craft. Like for engineers who just love writing code by hand, who find meaning kind of in like the artisanship, right, of doing it. Malt does represent like a really structural shift. And as AI is going to be the primary author of code, I think that cultural shift has to happen. Or when we talk about fully agentic workflows, right, that looks a lot different for somebody who's sat in front of a computer and crafted code for almost their entire professional career. So the cultural shift is probably the hardest thing that we have to manage when we're talking to potential clients who have not yet adopted AI across their organizations. And I think it'll continue to be a challenge until we get a couple years from now and it just becomes a new normal everywhere.
I guess taking a step back, right? Anytime you're creating a new business, regardless of whether it's AI coding related or even a consumer facing type of business, there's a lot of starts and stops and iterations as far as like finding the right product set solution for your specific customers and product market fit. What are some of the things that you thought were really going to be a home run when you started that were like, maybe that's not as important as we thought? And what are some of the areas where you saw like a massive amount of pool that you have really reinvested in?
Yeah, I think the one thing that comes to mind is positioning. I think like when individuals hear governance, it lands differently than when a decision maker hears it, right? To an engineering leader who's seen what ungoverned AI can do to a code base, potentially it's probably music to their ears. But I think someone that hasn't gotten there yet, it sounds like friction. And we led with that. Our tagline was the governance layer for AI assisted development. And that's what we went to market with. And so we had to get much more precise about how we describe Malt, like what it does, the problem it solves. I think the word governance is accurate for sure, but it's not always the right entry point depending on where somebody is in their AI journey. When we figured out like what the typical ICP was, these two groups, one that's already deploying and kind of feeling the pain points and one that's a little bit too scared, you got to position governance differently. So where we double down is those very two specific ICPs. And like those are our two customers essentially. Everything in our go to market is built around those two problems. And so we're very intentional when we pull out the word governance, how we explain that to people and what our paid media even looks like and how we describe it. So I would say that's probably like the biggest issue that we've hit and kind of still are grappling with as we continue to go to market.
Have you seen instances where because folks are using Malt, it actually enables more non-technical users to start kind of the code generation pathway and not create as much AI slop to where then a software developer or an engineering lead is actually kind of able to review these things and get more successful pull requests out of it? Or is it still mainly engineering talent that is leveraging Malt as like the primary user?
Yeah. So we started as a VS Code extension, went after retail just to kind of build trust in the developer community. I think the big thing is a lot of folks are used to like the linters and the code reviewers of the world, and those are great. And those are adjacent competitors, and they still have their place in the developer workflow. We're not replacing them. It's a new category. I think a lot of people were used to it being like a 1-2 click install tool that's very lightweight. Malt is not lightweight. It's not a tool. It's infrastructure. So it's very robust. And though it kind of has this invisible feel to it, there's still some lifting that has to be done. Initially, we tried to go after like the entire spectrum, right? Vibe coders, all the way to senior engineers. I think senior engineers that may have better wherewithal from a technical capability appreciate it a lot more. That a vibe coder, it's a lot of heavy lifting for a vibe coder. But I will say, if you can get past onboarding with Malt, I mean, you can take a t-shirt business right from it just works locally to, yeah, it works in production and you can start making money. That's what Malt allows you to do, is it gives anybody really the ability to actually unleash AI to its fullest capability. But I will say that like the enterprises of the world, the engineering teams, the guy that's been doing this for a long time, when they start using Malt, they're kind of going to be like scratching their heads, like, how come nobody else is like try to solve this problem? Because like I said, my CTO is cranking 60 to 80 PRs a day with like near zero rework. And it's almost like unbelievable. I think, yeah, it's more suited to somebody who's really looking to ship production grade code from day one.
How is like the competitive space look like today? I guess from talking to other folks, the problem that you're talking about is a real problem that exists in every organization, because almost the first use case they try to apply AI to is software engineering, right? But have you seen folks trying to use like some sort of scaffolding of different skills that they feed to Claude that kind of gives them guidelines about how they should code? Or like, what are you seeing folks using today?
Yeah, I mean, there's scaffolded solutions everywhere. I think people are, hobbling by. Much of what exists today is advisory, right? So we're talking like rule files, right? Based driven development, writing a great and robust prompt, guideline documents, prompt that tells the agent like how it needs to behave. And then agents read those when it's convenient, right? They ignore it when it's not. And that's not enforcement. It's what we call hope at Malt. And so like we know that AI follows a path of least resistance. We call it the happy path, right? So it's eventually it's going to drift, right? I think we're different because of that. Like we say it's physics and not policy. And so like rule files are just a suggestion sitting in a text file, but runtime hooks, for example, like it intercepts the file system operation itself. So the agent never gets the option to ignore it. That distinction matters enormously at scale for an enterprise organization or even a startup, right? So I think the second differentiator is the multi-agent architecture. So like we're not governing a single session, we're governing like a fleet of agents. So think like 6 or 7, specialized agents that are, scoped with permissions, have isolated workspaces and, complete audit trail. No one else is doing that at this kind of depth. A lot of people are running either semi-autonomous or fully autonomous multi-agent workflows, but without governance. And so I think you're compounding a lot of the rework and a lot of the issues that you would get from one agent, right, when you have multiple. And I think the third is we're the only player with enforce end-to-end workflow from planning through compliance that's built as an actual product, like out of the box, not a consulting agreement, right? So like you install it and the workflow is available immediately and you can get started. Like we just signed a really huge multinational organization for a paid pilot. And those guys chose us over Oracle and Microsoft, evaluating out some of the biggest bellwethers that are out there. So I think that tells you something about people that are searching for actual governance, a product that was meant to truly solve these issues that they're seeing.
Yeah, that's really cool. And you did mention about how traditionally things like rework, it's hard to measure, or maybe they don't have a good baseline to compare it against. So when you're going up against the likes of like a Microsoft or an Oracle, what are some of the metrics or like key indicators that you look at, and like what do you try and optimize for or focus on?
I think that's a great question. That is something we've thought about internally a lot, right? Because it helps us prove the value and the ROI, but you have to have a baseline and be able to measure against. So what we've done is our CTO, who will I love to praise because he's truly just a genius when it comes to building this product and doing it so fast, is like having a health check. So when you run Malt Enterprise, actually we'll kind of go back on your brownfield code bases and give you kind of like a health score to understand exactly where you sit, right? And that could be even pre AI, right? Human written code or AI generated code. So you're going to start with the baseline. And then what we'll do is we're going to show you kind of like how you use Malt and how you start accelerating that within your workflow, what that looks like. And some of the things we look at are things like duplicated code. So we use Malt to build Malt. So kind of like the proof is in the pudding. And we have a 0.18% revert rate on AI generated code, and about 85% of our code was AI generated. We have about a 2.5% code duplication rate on just human generated code, right? That's going to be probably 10 to 15%. And with AI generated code, those stats don't really exist. You could probably imagine that those would at least be probably double that. But we do those health checks. We try to gather a baseline and report on those metrics. So decision makers at least know, like, hey, I am getting the ROI from all that they're talking about. So I think we do a good job. We have a custom console panel that you can get with Enterprise that can allow you to do like full audits, understand, get a gauge of where the code base sits, and then run those type of metrics.
I guess with things moving so quickly in the industry and just like the pace of change being so fast with AI in general, how do you think about strategic planning, and where do you guys want to be if you look like 6 to 12 months in the future from now?
I worked in the hospitality industry, which moves like molasses, right? So going to an AI native company and working in this space, you have to be incredibly nimble and flexible. We are constantly reading newsletters, getting involved in developer communities to understand like what's the newest and what's the thing everybody's talking about. And we constantly try to, I think, adopt some of those things and put it into the product. Like I know a couple months ago was everybody was talking about the Ralph loop, and like we ended up putting, something very similar to that in Malt. And so we're constantly making sure we're ahead of the game. We have to move lightning fast. So we don't just talk about enabling velocity. We live that at Malt. We have to, or we'll get overtaken just like the next guy. I will say we're first to market in a true sense of the problem and how we're solving it. I don't think anyone's solving governance so quite like Malt is, but that doesn't mean, right, like a week in an AI universe is, right, a couple months in terms of what can happen and how fast things are moving. So we're constantly just looking on ways to iterate, stay ahead of the game, understand where the industry is going.
A lot of times when people are first to market or businesses are, there's all of this energy and time and communication of kind of explaining the problem. Is that as big of a deal for you guys, or how much education goes into the customer engagement journey?
Yeah, honestly, we've had to do a lot of educating. I think being a first mover in an entirely new category, which that's what we're operating in, there's a responsibility to kind of educate your consumer, which I think we've done a pretty good job on. It does make us move a little bit slower and go to market than we'd like. I also think that there's a lot of doubt that comes with it. I think even when we've talked to VCs, right, a lot of people, the pushback we get is like, hey, why couldn't a Claude build this? And I think absolutely they could. But I think when you look at businesses, one, that they're probabilistic in nature, that they're, again, optimizing for the next best word or their next best line of code, it becomes really, really hard to get very specific and optimize for specific architect requirements for one specific company, right? I think also when you have a token-based model, the economics just don't work, right? When you're able to use a legacy model, right, and have it operate just as well as the newest thing because you're using Malt, and that's how efficient we allow you to operate. So I think there's a lot of things that go against the grain there. I think there's a lot of doubt where they look at my co-founder, they see that I'm from the hospitality industry, and they're kind of like, how could these three people solve this problem? Which is us to make sure that the product puts its money where its mouth is, so to speak, which we're doing. Malt works and we stand by that. But I think we're very close to like one big thing here, the open clause of the world and kind of those stories where there'll be a lot more regulation, I think, like we're seeing in the European Union. And I think more and more people will understand kind of what we're trying to solve. That happens. But again, we're not waiting for that. I think as soon as people deploy, I think honestly, the people that understand the value Malt brings, and it might seem backwards, are the ICP where they are wanting to deploy AI. They see their competitors deploying it, right? And announcing that and kind of wearing that badge of honor. And they think, well, we don't want to get left behind. But how do we do this and how do we adopt it at scale and how do we do it safely without all the risk? And I think those folks are way more open to kind of hearing what we have to say because we've just given them kind of that green light.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd like to expand on that a little bit. It's like, how do you even find people that are in that leg of the journey?
Right. Yeah, I think it's understanding which industries are moving faster on it. For instance, you saw the F1 partnership with Claude not too long ago, right? So then you look into kind of like these racing teams and stuff, and you kind of understand like who else in the industry is probably seeing those same signals. Right. A lot of leads that we get are just cold leads. I think we've done a really, really great job in our paid media expressing the pain points that we've spoken about. So I do think it's resonating with a lot of folks. I like to say product market fit is a little hard, but for us, problem market fit, we've got a great fit for that. But it's tough, right, to understand like who is at that kind of inflection point of, hey, do we deploy or not? And like, where do you find them? How do you even know that they're contemplating those decisions? But we have a certain way that we look for signals. And I think so far we've been pretty successful with that.
One final question for you before we wrap up. So you've gotten to see, I think, this from both an outsider's perspective and an insider's perspective now, kind of this realm. And I guess, what do you think is one kind of common misconception that tech leaders have about AI, or something that they have as an assumption about AI assisted development that's just wrong in your experience?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is that the productivity gains are coming. I think they think if they just give it time, right, the ROI is going to just show up. A lot of leadership posts or newsletters around this, it won't, right? And I think without enforcement, it won't. I think I said before, 93% of developers are using AI to code. That output has only increased 10%. There's a gap there. I don't think the gap is the AI. I think the AI is doing what is intended to do, right? Which is generating code or any output faster than ever. I think the gap is that everything it generates has to be reviewed, right? Fixed. It has to be cleaned up before it can ship. And so the rework is eating at that velocity. I think tech leaders are, I think they're waiting for the models to improve and close that gap. I don't think that'll happen. I think better models will still generate ungoverned output. The problem is really structural, and I don't think it's generational. Those are meant to be sexy, right? It's a sexy business. I think the leaders, though, that figured this out first, who put enforcement in place before they scale AI across their entire engineering org, those are the ones who are going to actually capture like those productivity gains that we mentioned. I think everyone else is really running on an expensive experiment with no ROI.
Yeah, when everyone has the FOMO of missing out, I agree. I feel like there's like a CEO whisper that's going around and talking to people and saying, you got to get on the AI train or else you'll miss out on everything, right? And then that starts this frenzy without kind of clear understanding of what needs to happen in order to actually translate that into ROI. So completely agree. Well, Kim, really enjoyed the conversation. Where should people go to find out more about what you guys are up to?
Yeah, malt.ai or email me directly at kim@malt.ai and let's talk.
Sounds great. Thanks, Kim.
Yeah, thank you so much.